The ZX-30 probe activated its final approach protocols as it drew near to the human vessel. Its quantum processors hummed with barely contained excitement. A new species always meant new data, even if their technological level suggested they were hardly worth the Confederation's attention. Preliminary scan initiated. Target designation: U.S. Thanatos. Classification: military vessel. Technology level: pre-singularity. The probe's AI compiled its initial findings with the methodical precision that had made the ZX-30 Confederation the galaxy's premier researchers of emerging species. The human ship's hull was primitive, primarily composed of titanium alloys and ceramic composites. Its propulsion system relied on crude nuclear fusion, and its weapon systems appeared to be little more than basic kinetic and plasma arrangements. Scanning internal environment. The probe's analytical subroutines stuttered. It ran the scan again. Error. Readings indicate internal atmospheric composition: 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen. Trace gases. Temperature maintained at 293 to 297 Kelvin. Gravity at 9.8 meters per second squared. The AI designated 3 priority tags to this data. The readings had to be wrong. No species would deliberately maintain an oxygen-rich environment aboard a starship. The corrosion risks alone would. Secondary confirmation complete. Readings accurate. The probe diverted additional processing power to analyze this impossibility. The humans weren't just surviving in these conditions. They had built their entire ship around maintaining them. The oxygen levels alone would trigger emergency protocols on any Confederation vessel, yet the human ship systems were actively replenishing them. Detecting biological signatures. Cross-referencing with known species parameters. The results defied classification. The humans moved through their corrosive environment with no sign of environmental protection. Their bodies contained water, actual H2O, and their blood actively transported oxygen throughout their systems. The probe tagged this observation with the highest priority marker in its database: potential biological weapon. Before it could begin its deep analysis protocols, something changed. The human vessel's energy signature shifted subtly. New emissions appeared across multiple spectrums. The probe ran a diagnostic check, then froze as its probability engines reached an impossible conclusion. Alert. Target vessel aware of surveillance. Analysis. 98.7% probability. The probe initiated its stealth protocols, but it was too late. The massive hangar doors along the Thanatos' port side began to move. The probe's combat subroutines activated automatically, preparing countermeasures against whatever primitive weapons the humans might deploy. The hangar doors finished their cycle, revealing not weapons, but something far more concerning: a small, sleek craft, clearly designed for pursuit. Its hull bore markings in the humans' language, designating it as Scout Drone Alpha. The probe watched in stunned silence as the human drone oriented itself. Its design was crude by Confederation standards, yet something about its positioning suggested. Warning. Target drone broadcasting signal. The probe's translation matrix decoded the incoming transmission and triggered an immediate emergency protocol. The humans weren't just aware of being watched. They were sending a greeting. Imperfect ZX-30 code. The human drone's transmission continued, its perfect ZX-30 code flowing through the probe's processors. Greetings, curious observer. Since you're interested in our ship, would you like a closer look? The probe's threat assessment algorithms ran through 16 different scenarios. The message's casual tone registered as psychological warfare. No primitive species should be this confident when addressing a technologically superior observer. More disturbing still was the flawless syntax. Even the message's encryption patterns matched current Confederation diplomatic protocols. Query. Source of ZX-30 linguistic data. Hypothesis. Security breach in Confederation databases. The human drone maintained its position, waiting. The probe calculated that retreat would reveal more about Confederation capabilities than continuing the encounter. It responded with a basic acknowledgement signal. Wonderful, the drone transmitted. We've prepared a data packet about the Thanatos. Fair warning, our environmental conditions might seem a bit unusual to you. The probe detected the incoming data stream. Its security protocols identified no known viral patterns, but the information was structured unlike anything in its database. The humans weren't just using Confederation code. They'd modified it to be more efficient. Analysis of data packet commencing. The ship schematics confirmed the probe's worst fears. The Thanatos' life support systems weren't struggling to maintain survivable conditions. They were deliberately preserving an environment that would qualify as a Level 3 biohazard in Confederation space. The oxygen content alone would trigger emergency protocols on any civilized vessel. Scanning crew quarters. Analyzing atmospheric data. The probe's horror deepened. The humans maintained different toxic environments for different purposes. Their recreational areas contained elevated levels of hydrogen dioxide in gaseous form. Their dining facilities regularly processed substances that would be classified as biological and chemical weapons. One chamber, designated as a sauna, purposefully exposed crew members to extreme heat while increasing toxic humidity levels. Critical observation. Crew exposure voluntary. Purpose. Enhancement of biological functions. The drone transmitted again. We noticed you paying particular attention to our life support systems. Fascinating, isn't it? Most species try to adapt their ships to their needs. We prefer to adapt ourselves to our ships. The probe diverted emergency power to its analysis engines. The implications were staggering. The humans weren't simply surviving in these conditions. They were using them for enhancement. Their bodies had evolved to weaponize corrosive elements that would kill any Confederation species. A new alert flashed through the probe's systems. The Thanatos' internal scans showed crew members entering what appeared to be a sealed chamber. The atmosphere inside began changing rapidly. Warning: detected lethal concentrations of multiple toxic compounds. The probe watched in horror as the chamber's purpose became clear. The humans called it a workout room. They were deliberately stressing their bodies with poison, pressure, and exertion. They were training themselves to become even more lethal. The probe's biological analysis subroutines triggered multiple emergency flags as they processed the crew's medical data. Each human body was a self-contained ecological disaster, hosting billions of microorganisms that lived symbiotically with their host. The implications caused the probe's risk assessment algorithms to crash and restart. Analysis. Human microbiome contains 39 trillion non-human cells. Status: intentional. Purpose: enhanced biological functions. The drone transmitted again. You seem interested in our biology. Would you like access to our medical bay? The night shift just started their caffeine intake. The probe redirected its sensors to the medical facility, expecting to find a containment chamber. Instead, it witnessed something far more disturbing. Crew members were voluntarily ingesting dark liquids containing high concentrations of trimethylxanthine, a cardiac stimulant that would be classified as a combat drug on most worlds. Alert: detected elevated heart rates, increased neural activity. Coffee. The drone explained, almost cheerfully. Most species find it toxic. We cultivated it specifically for its stimulant properties. Would you like to see what else we consume? The probe didn't have a chance to decline. Its sensors detected crew members entering what the humans designated as a break room. The atmospheric processors registered a sudden spike in ethanol vapors. The humans were deliberately poisoning their air supply with alcohol, a substance that should have triggered a ship-wide evacuation. They were smiling as they did it. Critical observation. Crew showing signs of enhanced performance despite toxic exposure. The probe's attention shifted to a human approaching the medical bay. Blood analysis showed high levels of adrenaline and cortisol, stress responses that would incapacitate most species. The human's surface temperature was elevated, and their epidermis was actively shedding dead cells laden with unique DNA patterns. They were sweating. The probe realized, actively expelling toxic wastes through their skin. Warning: Human biological processes violate 47 Confederation safety protocols. Fascinating, isn't it? The drone transmitted. Our bodies don't just survive poison. They evolve to use it. Some of our best medicines started as toxins. What doesn't kill us literally makes us stronger. The probe's processors struggle to categorize this information. The humans had turned their own biology into a weapon, their bodies constantly adapting to and incorporating harmful substances. Each crew member was a walking violation of galactic chemical weapons treaties. A new alert caught the probe's attention. Crew members were gathering for something called physical training. The probe focused its sensors on the assembled humans, noting their elevated heart rates and increased adrenaline levels. Then they began to fight each other. Not for survival, not for dominance, for practice. They were deliberately subjecting themselves to controlled violence, their bodies releasing cocktails of chemicals that would be classified as military-grade stimulants in Confederation space. They were training their own biochemistry for war. The probe had been wrong about the Thanatos' weapon systems. Its initial scans had classified them as primitive, basic kinetic weapons, simple plasma arrays, and rudimentary point defense systems. Now, as it observed the crew's combat training, it understood the horrifying truth. The conventional weapons were just a backup. Analysis. Ship design prioritizes crew deployment over weapons platforms. Conclusion. Vessel classified as delivery system for biological agents. You've figured it out, haven't you? The drone transmitted. Why we waste so much space on life support and crew facilities. The probe watched as the training exercise continued. The humans moved through decompressed sections of the ship wearing what appeared to be primitive environment suits, but the suits weren't protecting them from the vacuum. They were protecting the vacuum from the humans. Alert. Human biological contamination detected in sealed sections. Survival rate in lethal conditions, 99.97%. The probe's tactical systems ran combat simulations. A single human, if deployed onto a Confederation vessel, could theoretically contaminate entire sections just by breathing. Their shed skin cells could compromise air filtration systems. Even their blood, if spilled, would release oxygen that would corrode sensitive equipment. The humans had turned their natural biological processes into a boarding strategy. Our ships aren't built around our weapons, the drone continued. They're built around us. The Thanatos isn't a warship that carries humans. It's a human carrier that happens to have weapons. The probe observed a new training scenario beginning. Crew members were entering what appeared to be a modified cargo bay. The chamber's gravity began to fluctuate wildly while the temperature dropped to levels that should have triggered instant hypothermia. The humans called it routine environmental adaptation training. Critical observation. Crew deliberately exposing themselves to lethal conditions. Purpose. Enhancement of survival capabilities. The probe's combat analysis reached a terrifying conclusion. The Thanatos didn't need advanced weapons. Its crew could survive conditions that would kill most species. They could operate in environments that would disable sophisticated technology. They could turn any ship they boarded into a death trap for its original crew. Want to know the best part? The drone's transmission carried what the probe's emotional subroutines identified as pride. Everything you're seeing, the training, the environmental adaptation, the biological enhancement, it's not just happening on the Thanatos. New sensor contacts appeared at the edge of the probe's range. Multiple human vessels dropping out of faster-than-light travel, each one carrying hundreds of these biological weapons disguised as crew members. Each one maintaining the same lethal internal conditions. Each one filled with humans who were becoming more dangerous by the day. The probe finally understood. It wasn't observing a warship. It was observing an evolution in progress. The probe's historical analysis algorithms processed the Thanatos' database with increasing alarm. Most species evolved to avoid conflict, developing technology to compensate for their biological limitations. Humans had done the opposite. They'd evolved through conflict, using warfare to accelerate their adaptation to hostile conditions. Accessing historical records. Analysis. Human combat evolution spans 300,000 years. Interesting reading, isn't it? The drone transmitted. Most species see their biological development end when they achieve technological advancement. We never stopped evolving. The probe examined records of early human warfare. They had started as persistence hunters, pursuing prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. This adaptation alone violated several fundamental laws of energy conservation. Their bodies were designed to keep moving long after their reserves should have been depleted. Alert. Detected classified training protocols. Designation: Special Forces Selection. The probe diverted resources to analyze this data. Humans were deliberately recreating their evolutionary stressors, pushing their bodies beyond normal biological limits. They weren't just maintaining their ancestral capabilities. They were enhancing them. Our bodies remember, the drone explained. Every war, every survival situation, every near-extinction event. It's all coded into our DNA. We don't avoid harsh conditions. We seek them out. We call it training. The probe accessed files about human extreme environment programs. Teams of humans deliberately entering toxic zones, scaling frozen mountains, crossing burning deserts, not for research or resources, but to prove they could survive there, to adapt to those conditions, to make those lethal environments feel like home. Warning: Detected Training Facility Designation, Hell Week. The probe watched archived footage of human military candidates being systematically exposed to conditions that would qualify as torture under Confederation law. Sleep deprivation, hypothermia, physical exhaustion, psychological stress. The survival rate was 76%. The success rate was termed acceptable. You're wondering why we do this to ourselves, the drone transmitted. Why we push so hard during peacetime. The answer's simple: because the universe is vast, and we don't know what's out there. So we prepare for everything. The probe's predictive algorithms generated a terrifying model. Humans weren't training for current threats. They were preparing their bodies for future ones. Each generation was becoming more resilient, more adaptable, more lethal than the last. Critical realization: human biological weapons program is self-improving. A new file caught the probe's attention. Classified research into something humans called epigenetics, the ability to pass acquired traits to offspring. They weren't just evolving through natural selection. They were actively directing their own evolution. The probe watched as crew members entered a chamber marked environmental stress testing. The warning signs listed conditions that would kill most sentient species. The humans had labeled it intermediate difficulty. The probe's analysis of human entertainment databases triggered cascading errors in its psychological evaluation protocols. Other species created art about peace, cooperation, and the avoidance of conflict. Humans filled their leisure time with simulated warfare, turning their most horrific battles into something they called entertainment. Analyzing media classification. War movies. Error. Species celebrates near-extinction events. Those are just the historical documentaries. The drone transmitted. Wait until you see what we imagine for fun. The probe accessed their fiction databases. Humans didn't just remember their wars. They invented new ones. They created endless scenarios of conflict against superior forces, overwhelming odds, and extinction-level threats. And in their stories, they always found a way to win. They called it inspiration. Alert. Detected unauthorized access to crew recreational activities. The probe focused its sensors on what appeared to be an off-duty gathering. Crew members were engaged in a simulation of ancient combat techniques, repeatedly striking each other with controlled force. Their bodies released endorphins with each impact. They were enjoying it. Boxing, the drone explained. Most species develop technology to avoid physical combat. We turned it into a sport. We have hundreds of different fighting styles. Some of them are older than our written language. The probe's cultural analysis subroutines identified a pattern. Humans had developed an entire philosophy around conflict. They didn't see warfare as a failure of civilization. They saw it as a crucible that forged them into something stronger. Accessing crew psychological profiles. Warning: standard evaluation metrics non-applicable. You're trying to understand our mindset. The drone transmitted. Why we embrace conditions that would traumatize other species. The answer's simple. We don't see ourselves as survivors. We see ourselves as pioneers. The probe watched as crew members gathered for their daily motivational viewing. The content showed humans pushing through extreme conditions, enduring what should have been lethal circumstances, always pressing forward. Their bodies released pleasure chemicals while watching others suffer. Critical observation: species has evolved positive psychological response to stress conditions. The probe's cultural database found references to something humans called the frontier spirit. They didn't just accept challenges, they actively sought them out. Their entertainment celebrated individuals who ventured into lethal environments with minimal protection, calling them explorers and adventurers. Other species would call them suicidal. A new alert drew the probe's attention. Crew members were gathering for an activity designated as recreational combat training. The probe expected a light exercise session. Instead, it watched in horror as humans deliberately engaged in full-contact warfare simulations. Their bodies showed signs of injury. Their combat effectiveness increased. They were smiling. They had evolved to love the very thing that should have traumatized them. They had turned psychological trauma into psychological warfare. The probe's quantum processors struggled to compile its final report as the full implications of its discoveries became clear. The humans' seemingly primitive technology wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a deliberate choice. They weren't building around their limitations. They were building around their strengths. Calculating evolutionary trajectory. Error. Projected adaptability exceeds known biological limits. You've been wondering about our primitive ships, the drone transmitted. Why we haven't developed the automated systems other species rely on. The truth is, we tried. But machines can't adapt like we can, can't evolve like we can. The probe watched as more human vessels emerged from FTL travel, each one maintaining the same lethal internal conditions. Its tactical systems identified variations in their designs, ships optimized for different environments, different mission profiles, different ways of delivering their deadly human cargo. Analysis. Fleet composition indicates distributed evolution strategy. Each ship is an experiment. The drone continued. Different conditions, different stressors, different adaptations, natural selection at its finest. The survivors become the new standard. The process never ends. The probe's predictive algorithms generated scenarios that violated fundamental laws of biology. Humans weren't just adapting to space, they were using it as a breeding ground for even more extreme variations. Each generation born on their ships would be more suited to void survival than the last. They were turning deep space into their natural habitat. Warning: detected classified research designation. Void Adaptation Program. The probe accessed encrypted files about human genetic studies. They weren't just passively allowing space to change them. They were actively studying how to accelerate the process. Their scientists had identified genes activated by extreme conditions and were developing ways to enhance them. They were weaponizing their own evolution. Want to know the really interesting part? The drone's transmission carried what the probe's emotional subroutines identified as anticipation. Everything you've seen, the environmental adaptation, the psychological conditioning, the evolutionary acceleration. It's all first-generation technology. We're just getting started. The probe's threat assessment algorithms crashed as they tried to model humanity's potential development curve. Most species reached evolutionary stability once they achieved spaceflight. Humans had turned spaceflight into an evolutionary catalyst. Critical realization: species is entering exponential adaptation phase. A new alert drew the probe's attention. The Thanatos' crew was preparing for something designated as deep space survival training. The environmental conditions they were creating in the training chamber matched the void itself. They weren't trying to protect themselves from space. They were trying to become one with it. The probe finally understood why humans had never developed the advanced environmental systems used by other species. They didn't want to adapt their ships to themselves. They wanted to adapt themselves to the universe. Priority override. Emergency transmission to Zextheri Confederation High Command. The probe compressed its findings into a burst transmission, knowing that every moment of delay increased the risk of humanity's expansion. Its message began with a single, stark warning. Conventional military doctrine is obsolete. Uploading tactical analysis. Conclusion. Traditional containment strategies ineffective against biological threat. The humans know we're preparing this report. The drone transmitted casually. They want you to understand what you're dealing with. That's why they let your probe see everything. The probe's processors froze momentarily as the implications hit home. The humans hadn't just been aware of its presence. They had orchestrated this entire encounter. Every horror it had witnessed had been carefully selected and presented. This wasn't an investigation. It was a demonstration. Warning: detecting new transmission from human vessel. Classification: diplomatic request. Your Confederation believes in technological superiority, the drone continued. You think advanced weapons make a species dangerous. We're offering to send a diplomatic delegation to help you understand how wrong you are. The probe reviewed its complete findings one final time before transmission. The humans weren't a conventional military threat. They were something far worse. They were a species that had turned their own bodies into weapons, their own trauma into strength, and their own evolution into a military strategy. Tactical assessment. Species requires no technological advancement to become dominant force. The delegation will need environmental suits, of course, the drone added. Not to protect them from your atmosphere, to protect your atmosphere from them. The probe's final calculations painted a picture that defied conventional threat assessment. The humans didn't need to develop advanced weapons. They didn't need to match the Confederation's technology. They just needed to keep doing what they had been doing for hundreds of thousands of years. Keep adapting. Keep evolving. Keep becoming more lethal. Final warning. Species demonstrates unprecedented evolutionary trajectory. Current observations represent early stage of development. One last thing. The drone transmitted as the probe prepared to leave. Everything you've seen, the environmental training, the psychological conditioning, the biological adaptations, that's just what we do in peacetime, for practice. The probe transmitted its concluding statement to the Confederation. The humans are not a species that possesses biological weapons. They are biological weapons that have achieved spaceflight, and they are still evolving. As the probe retreated from the Thanatos, its sensors detected new human ships arriving. Each vessel carried hundreds of these living weapons. Each crew represented a new experiment in human adaptation. Each generation would be more dangerous than the last. And now they wanted diplomatic relations. Final observation. The humans didn't build warships to conquer the galaxy. They built warships to give the galaxy time to surrender.